The story of grief, Jesus teaching to his disciples. It was a quiet, cool evening by the Sea of Galilee. The sun had long disappeared, leaving only the faint glow of the stars and the gentle lap of the waves against the shore. Jesus and his disciples had gathered around a small fire, the flames flickering as the night settled in around them. The day had been filled with teaching and healing, but there was a heaviness that hung over the group, something unspoken yet palpable. Each of the disciples carried burdens, though they rarely spoke of them. The road they walked with Jesus was one of joy and purpose, but also of sacrifice. Many had left behind families, homes, and livelihoods. Some had watched loved ones pass from this life, and the grief of these losses clung to them like a shadow, even as they followed the one who gave them hope. It was a burden they bore in silence, for who could understand the ache of a heart that still grieved in the midst of such a divine calling? Jesus, who saw not only the actions of men but the deep stirrings of their hearts, knew that this unspoken sorrow needed to be addressed. He had seen the weariness in their eyes, the way some of them lingered in thought when they should have been rejoicing. He understood the weight they carried. Grief, he knew, was not just a passing emotion but a force that could reshape lives, hearts, and faith. And tonight, as they sat in the quiet stillness, was the time to speak to this pain. The fire crackled softly as Jesus began to speak. "My beloved friends," he said, his voice filled with warmth and compassion, "I see that your hearts are heavy. Though you do not speak of it, you carry grief with you. It is a burden that weighs upon the soul, and it can make even the brightest day seem dim. Grief is a part of life that touches everyone at some point, and yet, it is often the hardest to bear. But tonight I want to tell you a story about grief and loss, and about the love that remains even when everything else is gone." The disciples, who had been quietly reflecting on the events of the day, turned their full attention to Jesus. They knew that when he spoke, his words carried a depth of wisdom that would reach far beyond the surface. They listened intently, ready to receive whatever teaching he was about to offer. "There was once a man named Baruch," Jesus began, his voice steady and calm. "Baruch lived in a small village much like the ones we have traveled through. He was a man of faith, a man who loved God and loved his family. He had a wife, Miriam, who was his dearest companion, and together they had a son, Eli. Eli was the joy of their lives, a bright, spirited boy who brought laughter and light to their home. Baruch and Miriam cherished their son. Every morning, Baruch would rise early, look upon Eli as he slept, and whisper a prayer of gratitude for the blessing of his family." Jesus paused for a moment, allowing the disciples to imagine the scene, a peaceful home filled with love and joy. Some of them smiled slightly, remembering their own families and the happiness that children bring. But they knew that Jesus' stories often contained deeper meanings, and they waited, sensing that the tale would soon turn. "For many years," Jesus continued, "Baruch's life was filled with happiness. His son grew strong and healthy, and it seemed that the future was full of promise. Baruch often thought to himself, 'What more could I ask for? My heart is full and my life is blessed.' But one day something unexpected happened. Eli fell ill. At first, it seemed like a simple sickness, the kind that children recover from in time. But as the days passed, Eli's condition worsened. Baruch and Miriam did everything they could to help him, calling upon healers, offering prayers, caring for him night and day. But no matter what they did, Eli's strength continued to fade. As Jesus spoke, the disciples felt the weight of the story pressing upon them. They had seen sickness before, had witnessed the fragility of life. Some had even experienced the loss of a loved one, and they knew the pain of watching someone you love slip away. They could feel Baruch's fear and helplessness as his son's life hung in the balance. The day came, Jesus said, his voice quieter now, when Eli breathed his last. The light of Baruch and Miriam's lives was extinguished, and their home, once filled with laughter, was now filled with silence. Baruch, who had always been a man of faith, found himself questioning everything. He asked, "Why, God? Why did you take my son? How could this happen? Why was my prayer not answered?" His grief was so overwhelming that he could barely stand under its weight. The disciples sat in silence, the story resonating with their own memories of loss. Peter thought of the day he had left his family behind to follow Jesus, wondering if he would ever see them again. John remembered the passing of his father, a quiet man who had taught him the trade of fishing. Each disciple carried with them memories of loss, and as Jesus spoke, those memories surfaced, reminding them of the grief they had buried deep within. Baruch, Jesus continued, was overcome with grief. He wandered the hills for days, unable to bear the sight of his empty home or the sound of silence where his son's laughter had once been. The pain in his heart was so deep that it felt like a physical wound, one that would never heal. He cried out to God, asking for an explanation, but no answer came. The sky remained silent, and the world went on as if nothing had changed. At this, one of the disciples, Thomas, who was often the most reflective and questioning, spoke up. "Master," he said, his voice quiet but filled with the weight of his own thoughts, "why does God remain silent in our grief? Why, when we are at our most broken, does it feel as if we are abandoned?" Jesus looked at Thomas, his eyes filled with understanding. "Thomas," he said gently, "God is never silent, though it may seem that way to the grieving heart. In the deepest moments of sorrow, it is not that God is far from you, but that your heart is too wounded to hear Him. Grief can make us feel as though we are alone, but I promise you, God is always with you, even in the silence. His presence is there, waiting for the heart to be still enough to feel it." The disciples fell quiet again, reflecting on Jesus' words. Grief, they realized, was not something that could be easily explained or dismissed. It was a journey, one that required faith and patience. Jesus resumed the story. One evening, as Baruch sat alone on a hillside, watching the sun set over the distant horizon, a stranger approached him. The man was dressed in simple robes, and his face was kind, though lined with the marks of many years. Without a word, the stranger sat down beside Baruch, and together they watched as the sky darkened and the stars began to appear. For a long time they sat in silence, the only sound the gentle wind moving through the grass. Then finally the stranger spoke. "Tell me," he said, "why do you weep?" Baruch, whose grief had been bottled up for so long, felt something inside him break open. He poured out his heart to the stranger, telling him of the loss of his son, of the unbearable pain that now filled his life, and of his anger toward God for allowing such a thing to happen. "I prayed," Baruch said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I prayed every day for my son to be healed, but God did not answer. How can I continue to believe in a God who allowed this to happen? How can I go on living with this pain?" The stranger listened quietly, nodding as Baruch spoke, his eyes filled with understanding and compassion. When Baruch finished, the stranger spoke again, his voice calm and gentle. "Grief," he said, "is a burden that we all must carry at some point in our lives. It is the weight of love. The deeper the love, the deeper the grief. But grief is not a sign that you have been abandoned by God. Nor is it a punishment. Rather, grief is the evidence of how much your heart has loved." Jesus paused, and the disciples absorbed these words. Love and grief were intertwined, they realized. You could not have one without the other. The depth of the pain reflected the depth of the love. The stranger continued, "Jesus said, You ask why God did not answer your prayers. But sometimes God's answer is not the one we expect. Your son was precious to God just as he was to you. And though his life on this earth has ended, his spirit is alive in the presence of the one who created him. Your prayers were heard and your son is not lost. He is with God in a place where there is no more pain, no more suffering. You will see him again, for death is not the end. It is only a doorway to something greater. Baruch, though still grieving, felt a warmth spread through his chest, a small flicker of hope in the darkness of his sorrow. But how do I go on? He asked. How do I live with this emptiness? The stranger placed a hand on Baruch's shoulder and said, You carry it. Not alone but with the help of God. He knows your pain, for he too has known loss. And just as he carried your son into his arms, so too will he carry you through this grief. It will not disappear, but over time it will change. The sharpness of the pain will soften, and though the sorrow will remain, so too will the memory of the love you shared. That love is eternal, and nothing, not even death, can take it away. When Baruch turned to thank the stranger, he was gone. But Baruch knew in his heart that he had not been left alone. God had sent him comfort in his time of deepest sorrow, and though his grief remained, he now had the strength to carry it. Jesus paused once more, his eyes sweeping over his disciples. He could see that the story had touched them deeply, for many of them had experienced loss in their own lives. Then Jesus spoke again, his voice gentle but firm. My dear friends, grief is something that touches every life. It is a part of the human experience just as love is. But do not think that your grief means you are abandoned by God. Grief is the evidence of love, and the deeper the love, the deeper the grief. But know this, God is with you in your sorrow. He does not leave you to carry it alone. And in time, the sharpness of your pain will soften, and you will find peace, not because you have forgotten, but because you have learned to carry your love and your loss together. And remember, the love you have for those you have lost does not end with death. It remains, for love is eternal. One day in God's kingdom, you will be reunited with those you have loved, and there will be no more death, no more sorrow, no more tears. Until that day, trust that God walks with you in your grief, and he will give you the strength to carry on. The disciples sat in silence, reflecting on the depth of what Jesus had said. They had each carried grief in their own way, but now they understood that they did not carry it alone. They were not abandoned in their sorrow. God was with them, carrying their burdens and giving them the strength to continue. As the night deepened and the stars shone brightly overhead, the disciples felt a quiet peace settle over them. Though they would each face more grief in their lives, they knew they were not alone. The love of God was with them, guiding them, comforting them, and carrying them through every trial. And with that, they rested, knowing that their grief was understood, carried, and ultimately healed by the one who had walked with them every step of the way. This is end of the story. Please like this video and subscribe my channel for more Jesus story like this.